Hello again. I want to speak to you today about symptoms. And you might be wondering, symptoms? Aren't those the things that I would seek out medical treatment for, to try to eradicate, to try to get rid of? You are correct. Yes, symptoms are problems that often send us into offices such as mine. And at the same time, I think one of the great things about naturopathic medicine is this orientation that we have towards symptoms. So let me inform you as to what that orientation is. So number one, symptoms are essentially not the problem themselves, right? There's an underlying root or cause of the symptoms. The symptoms are essentially your being's message from the deep, your message to change something, to address something that's not being addressed, to recognize something that's not being recognized, to essentially hear a message from your being that tells you something's out of balance. So orienting yourself towards that first, that message, that communication, is really important in terms of taking charge of your own health. And not necessarily to have a perspective that instantly wants to eradicate the symptoms, but rather to first try to listen to the message, okay? And when I say symptoms, I'm speaking very broadly. I'm speaking in terms of what could be mental emotional symptoms, anxiety, a low mood, a high mood, an unstable mood, or even beyond that into panic attacks, right? Essentially, anxiety comes from this space of, it's a fear, right? You're anxious about something because because you fear something. Now, sometimes that fear, it's not always easy to pinpoint what it exactly is that you are fearing. And sometimes it's just sort of a mechanism of, you have a boundary that's being infringed upon, and you're anxious because you sense in your being on some level that this boundary is being steamrollered over by something or someone. And so it's important to kind of first orient towards your anxiety. Okay, what's the message? Why am I anxious? What's it connected to? And to explore that a little bit. So symptoms, like I said, are essentially messages from the deep. They're messages to tell you, to communicate something. By analogy, let me jump into parenting, right? Those of you that are parents, at some point your child, I'm assuming you didn't skip over infancy. Maybe if you're adopted you did, but other than that, if you have a child, your child came to you through infancy. And in that process, you likely learned what all of us learn, which is, gosh, babies can't talk. Not the same as the adult world. They can't communicate in quite the same way. And what babies have, essentially, is communication in the form of crying or moving their bodies in different mechanisms to communicate something to you. But essentially, crying is their language. And so as a parent, part of your job is to become a detective in figuring out, why is this infant crying? Is this baby hungry? Does this baby need its diaper changed? Etc., right? The crying itself is not the problem. And I would say some of the parenting methods out there that advocate for essentially teaching your child, or using essentially a Skinner to train a baby that their crying is ineffective, not necessarily the best strategy, because essentially you're shutting down communication. You're informing this child that, you know what, because we're on a schedule here, when you cry, I don't respond to it. And that's undermining communication, which is, in my opinion, not in the child's best interest developmentally in any way. I'm not here to talk about parenting methods. I'm here to talk about symptoms. But my analogy is that just as a baby cries, and those cries are essentially communication to the parent that there's something that needs addressing, right? That's what I've been arguing about symptoms. There's something that needs addressing, and whether it be, could you please change my diaper, or I need to be held, or I'm scared, or I'm hungry, your role as a parent is to figure some of those things out, and sometimes to distinguish between the sound of the cry when it's various things. So what we're doing in naturopathic medicine is a similar thing. We're tuning into the cries of your being. We want to listen and try to distinguish, okay, why is this here? What's the point? It's not just randomness. It's not a symptom that just pops up out of nowhere and, oh my gosh, all of a sudden I'm having panic attacks. No, there's a point. And orienting yourself towards what is that point is, I think, one of the first steps on the path to healing. The second thing that you might not have considered when it comes to symptoms is the fact that symptoms themselves can sometimes be an expression of the healing response. And so if you immediately move to eradicate your symptoms, you could actually be working kind of against yourself. Certainly in the form of medicine that I practice, specifically homeopathy, symptoms are viewed as the body's or the being's attempt to right itself. So someone falls out of balance, and there is a healing force, a healing mechanism in all of us. If you will recall, the last time you cut your toe or a part of your skin was, the integrity of your skin was compromised, when that occurred, you didn't necessarily have to tell your skin, heal, right? Your skin goes through this process, and underneath the skin, I mean, you have white blood cells that move in, you have, the tissue reconnects, it starts to grow back together and sew itself back together, it stops the blood, you have a clotting mechanism. All these various physiological mechanisms that happen in the body are working adequately. They're doing what they're supposed to do. None of us had to tell our skin, go fix yourself, or let me tune you in. No, it just automatically does it, right? Without us interfering at all most of the time. So remember that. This runs all the way through physiology. That really almost every physiological mechanism has this switch where your body knows what to do when the skin is compromised. It moves in white blood cells, it cleans up the debris, it moves the tissue close together, and even, they're called cross-hatching, cross-hatching of connective tissue. There's certain things that can help the healing mechanisms go faster, and that tends to be a specialty really of naturopathic medicine, in that we know that vitamin C and connective tissue go together, and so in terms of forming those cross connections, you actually need vitamin C. Things like that. So recognize that your symptoms can be part of a healing mechanism, and you don't necessarily want to shut them down if that's the case. I offer another example in the form of fever, right? Oftentimes, conventionally, we've been taught that when your child has a fever, you give Tylenol, you bring the fever down, right? Danger, fever. The danger with a fever is really not so much with the temperature, but rather a few other mechanisms like dehydration that can come in if the fever is too high, or how rapidly the fever can go up. has sometimes been correlated with, say, a febrile seizure. But for the most part, a fever is a healing mechanism in the body. We know that all sorts of good things happen with a fever. Number one, your white blood cell production speeds up. Number two, how quickly you dispatch the white blood cells actually increases. Three, you actually take things out of the blood that are sometimes food sources for pathogens. So for example, iron and zinc. Actually, I know iron for sure. Zinc, I'm now drawing a blank on. But iron is often something that bacteria feed on, and so your body, which utilizes iron in the form of hemoglobin, actually takes some of that out of the blood to reduce the food source for a lot of potential bacteria. And this can be a good thing in terms of healing from a particular pathogen. Additionally, you tend to have a suppressed appetite, and again, there's a lot of energy that goes into digestion, particularly digestion of, say, proteins. So if you're not using your energy up in digesting foods, you can actually divert more of your energy to a healing immune response. And so that's kind of a natural connection there that tends to be the case, that your appetite is suppressed. So again, what are all these, why am I telling you all this? I'm telling you this because we need to listen to the body. We need to listen to the wisdom in what's actually happening rather than quickly reaching to suppress or to fear the healing response itself. I find that all the time, that people are afraid, too afraid. I think part of it is we've been culturally trained to be afraid of a healing response. Certainly that's the case I see on a mental emotional level. When people come to me, say in a grieving state, and sometimes in that process of grieving, our grief can get shut down. We tend to sometimes suppress, and maybe we don't have time to grieve. Maybe it's not the right scenario where, okay, I can't grieve in front of my friends and coworkers. And so when that happens, sometimes we actually shut down our grief. Well, grief is a healing mechanism, and we really have to go through it. We can't just suppress it, as sometimes we're conventionally taught to do. So given this, I've had patients where I put them on a remedy and they start crying a lot. And it can be unsettling, and I would say, that's a symptom that's part of the healing process. And to the extent that we can kind of yield to that process and allow that process to occur, tends to push us in a healthier direction. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say about symptoms. Again, I'll just recap two things. Remember, symptoms are communication from the deep. And number two, symptoms can be part of a healing mechanism that's worth allowing. So think about those things, and if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the comments below. Thank you for tuning in, and see you next time.